Welcome back, my name is Anthony, and you're probably here because you watched my video about all of the stimulus benefits that actually probably relate most to you out of this HEALS Act that is being proposed in Congress. And if you haven't watched that video yet, I recommend you go watch that one because that is the video that's going to go over everything that's probably going to affect your wallet, because most of the stuff that we're going to talk about in today's video is very important. However, it doesn't exactly have to do mostly with the American people and their finances. So check out that video over there. That's where we're going to talk about unemployment benefits as well as stimulus checks. But in this video, we're going to talk about the other 9 bills that make up the 10-bill HEALS Act. And I still do the air quotes over HEALS Act because it's actually 10 different acts. I don't know why they just put it together as one. And I got to come clean, nothing on the internet is new. And so I'm using a lot of information from an article on Forbes.com by Sarah Hansen that is called "Where is the Senate GOP's $1 trillion HEALS Act? Here's what we know about the mysteriously splintered proposal." And this is a really good article for you. I'm going to link it down in the description below, because if you want to check out the actual text of the bills or some of the summaries of the bills, you can do that there. However, it gives a pretty good overview, and we're going to be walking through an overview of the 9 bills. I'm not going to keep you here forever, but it is important to know what's going on as well as what some of the implications are. And the first bill that we're going to be going over today, which is actually the second bill in this little act cluster, is going to be an already controversial one called the Safe to Work Act. Now, the Safe to Work Act is actually an acronym for Safeguarding America's Frontline Employees to Offer Work Opportunities Required to Kickstart the Economy. And I understand why they want to put that in an acronym. This bill is a little bit controversial because it proposes putting a shield over businesses, healthcare providers, as well as schools in relation to the coronavirus crisis. So this would help those entities to not be sued over and over again for things that they likely don't have a lot of liability for. There's still going to be accountability, they say. However, there's going to be a little bit more leniency in the system through this bill. The purpose of that is so that businesses, healthcare providers, as well as schools don't have to act out of fear and just not do anything, knowing that they won't get sued for things that might not even actually be their fault, but could be a correlation rather than a causation kind of deal with the crisis going on right now. However, the reason that this is controversial is because it seems like the Republicans are really just trying to help take liability away from corporations and big entities rather than helping individuals and safeguarding individuals and people from these different companies. And people are saying that if they give all of this liability protection to these agencies and these different entities, then if someone's actually affected by them, they might not be able to actually get compensation for it, which would perpetuate the problem and keep the little guy down while it props up businesses and other people that Republicans are more traditionally aligned with. The second act is the Continuing Small Business Recovery and Paycheck Protection Program Act. Now, if you didn't know, the Paycheck Protection Program was a forgivable loan that the government gave out to businesses in order to keep people on payroll during the crisis. Now, if you didn't know, the Paycheck Protection Program provided forgivable loans to businesses in order to keep people on payroll so that they didn't have to go on to unemployment and they would be able to weather through the storm. Now, the PPP program has changed a lot since it was actually first passed, but this actually proposes to extend it for a second round. There are 3 main things that this bill does. First, it allows some businesses to actually apply for a second forgivable PPP loan. That way they'd be able to keep people on their payroll longer, as well as cover some of their utility expenses or mortgage or lease expenses. The second thing that it does is actually help businesses who applied for less than $150,000 to get their loans forgiven easier, so it eases those requirements. And third, it actually creates a long-term solution that's supposed to go past the crisis of a $60 billion fund to help businesses who are in crisis. Now, if you're wondering what were those qualifications to get those loans more easily forgiven if you applied for less than $150,000, then here are a couple of the options. The first is that under PPP, you had to spend 75% of it on wages and the other 25% on either mortgage, utilities, or lease. So they've actually added a list of other expenses that you can do that I'll read here. It can pay for any software, cloud computing, human resources, payroll, billing and accounting, costs related to property damage and vandalism from looting, supplier costs, and worker protection related social distancing, sanitation, and other safety requirements, just like the PPE that we talked about earlier in my last video. And the second benefit for making it more forgivable is they actually extended the period of time that you're able to use the funds and have it be forgiven. Initially, you had to use all the funds within 8 weeks. However, under the new plan, they've extended that out through the rest of 2020. Next is the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, and Related Agencies proposal. Now, this is basically a bunch of different grants for various parts of the government that would help them out during this time of crisis. However, there are a lot of things that are pretty controversial in here that might not necessarily make sense to be related to the pandemic. Let me explain. Now, some of the grants that most people would be able to agree on is that there's grants for labor, which would help people get back to work, as well as unemployment assistance. There's grants for the CDC in order to help fight this crisis and do better research. There's grants to fight substance abuse. There's grants for the National Institute of Health. There's grants for the Administration of Children and Families, Medicare and Medicaid services. And then, like I was talking about earlier, something that probably shouldn't be too controversial but has become very politicized is education grants. There's $105 billion to help people get back to school, which are earmarked for various different things. Most notably, $70 billion for elementary through high school education and $29 billion for higher education like colleges in order to get people back to school. But back to school doesn't look normal for most people nowadays because everyone's still debating whether or not people should actually go back to school, whether everybody should be on homeschool, whether there should be some sort of e-learning or distance learning. There's so many different options now, but this bill actually might be controversial for this reason exactly. The reason being, Trump and many Republicans have pushed for a lot of people to go back to school, and that means that 2/3 of the money for sending elementary through high school students back to school is earmarked for schools who are reopening, and they have minimum requirements for them to be able to get that money for the amount of people who have to be returning to the school and having it be reopened. Whereas only 1/3 of that money goes to any schools and is available immediately. That means that people basically have to comply with what President Trump wants in order to be receiving the majority of this funding. That's why it might be a little bit controversial. However, this bill is not nearly as controversial as the next bill that's a part of this HEALS Act that we're going to get to now. And that is the Coronavirus Response Additional Supplemental Appropriations Act. Now, a lot of the funding from this is going to things that most people would say are good, like the FDA, as well as helping our food supply chain and farmers so they can continue to make food so that we can continue to eat if we aren't subsistence farming for ourselves, which probably the majority of us watching this video are not doing. However, I'm going to read a tweet from Bernie Sanders that shows some of the other things that is put into this bill that is taken from the bill. It's not fluffed up just because it's from him. However, he says that this bill is dead on arrival because of these things that are in this bill, which I find a little bit difficult to understand how they're exactly correlated with the coronavirus crisis. So this bill includes $2 billion for F-35s, which are fighter jets, $1.7 billion for an FBI building, $1 billion for surveillance planes, $375 million for armored vehicles, $360 million for missile defense, $283 million for Apache helicopters, and then he ends it by saying that there's $0 million for facing evictions. And that's why he says that the bill is dead on arrival, because it seems like there are billions of dollars being appropriated to military things when this is supposed to be an economic stimulus bill, the HEALS Act. I'm not sure if that's just something that happens all the time in Congress, because I know that a lot of people just try to push stuff into other bills. However, as a taxpayer, I don't exactly understand why that is in this bill. I'm not arguing whether it is good or bad. I just don't understand exactly how it's related to the coronavirus crisis. And if you do understand, let me know in the comments down below. The next bill that's a part of this plan is not as controversial, but it is pretty weird how it came about, and it's the Time to Restore U.S. Trusts Act. United States Trust Acts, if you didn't know what U.S. stands for. This bill was proposed in 2019, and it makes a tiny bit of sense as to why it's in this bill now, fighting the coronavirus crisis, because it's an economic bill and it's talking about the future. However, it's about how trust funds in the U.S., which are like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, how those are going to be able to stay solvent for the next 75 years. However, there's some people who are saying that this is just so that Republicans can cut benefits to Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. However, basically with the coronavirus crisis right now, it's possible that Social Security Trust Fund could be depleted by 2030 or around that period of time. So there might be something that has to be done before that, because if that's the case and the trust fund is depleted, then payroll taxes only account for about 79% of the revenues. And again, I am sourcing this from this article that I referenced earlier that's down in the description down below. The next two bills are related to school. It's the Safely Back to School and Work Act and the School Choice Now Act. Now, this bill has provisions to help increase the stockpile of America's PPE as well as get better diagnostic testing. However, what most people would focus on from this bill is the student loan provisions. appropriations. And what they would focus on is what it leaves out, because student loan forbearance is actually coming up here within about the next month, and then you won't have any more forbearance because of COVID-19 if nothing changes. This bill doesn't quite address that. However, it does address student loan repayment, because it takes the 9 ways that you can repay student loans now and reduces that down to 2, making it a little bit easier. The first way is going to be a 10-year mortgage style payment, where it basically amortizes over the 10 years, which is a fancy way of saying that interest is in each of your payments until you get to the end and the interest amount decreases while the principal amount increases over those 10 years. And the second way is an income-based repayment plan. Those are the options that are proposed under this bill to change how student loans are repaid if they're federal loans. This bill would also allow people to get back to work and back to school, because it gives grants to childcare places to reopen so that people can get back to work and put their kids back in childcare, although some might not deem that as safe right now, as well as gives scholarships for K-12 students to help get them back to school. The interesting thing though is that those scholarships are only for homeschooling and private schooling. Basically, it's to give parents the choice of where their kids can go to school. This bill would also create a tax credit if you contribute to a scholarship organization. Now, this would actually be a permanent credit, so if you contribute to a scholarship granting organization, you would actually be able to get that credit on your taxes. This also gives states the liberty to create their own scholarship programs, and it prohibits the federal government from getting involved in those programs. The Restoring Critical Supply Chains and Intellectual Property Act is a part of this as well. Its goal is to move production of PPE, personal protective equipment, from China to the US. They want to do this within 5 years, and in order to do that, they're subsidizing it with $7.5 billion in tax credits. Now, I see a couple benefits of this, 2 namely. The first is that it'll create more American jobs, so I'm sure is one of the purposes of this. And the second, I'm sure probably isn't one of the purposes of this. However, it'll help to get away from Uighur labor concentration camps that the Chinese government has set up. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, do some research. It is important and it is abhorrent. I will leave some links down in the description below so that you can be informed. And finally, the last act as a part of this HEALS Act is the Supporting American Restaurant Workers Act. Now, this just changes the business tax deduction from 50% to 100% on business meals. So it basically wants you to go out and eat on your company's dime. If you haven't watched my video on the first bill out of these 10 in the HEALS Act, watch that right here, and I will see you there. Subscribe down below if you're new, and leave a comment about any questions you have about the stimulus bills, and I will try my best to get back to that comment with the correct answer, and if I don't know, I'll put it down there as well. Thanks.